views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Last week, the New York City Council passed an $88 billion budget, which still left a $9 billion shortfall. The budget was just about $5 billion less than it was last year. Decisions on funding are interesting. Many people are talking about what happened to the police budget, and we're going to talk about that. But really, if you look at budgets are really policy statements because they are set as this is what we're going to spend on. This is what we value. This is what our priorities are. And in this very unusual year, the New York City Legislature made some statements, and we're going to review a couple of those statements. Certainly the police budget needs a review. We'll talk about other budgetary items as well with the Bronx council member from the 11th City Council District. It is Andrew Cohen, council member. Nice to have you with us.
Thanks, Gary.
And also from the 16th Council District, it is council member Vanessa Gibson. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Gary. Good afternoon. Good evening.
I thought I would start with really a general question and get into each of your heads, so to speak, about the philosophy of the way you approached. Let's be specific about the police budget, which was just under $6 billion, and apparently $1 billion was cut. When you hear, let's start with you, Councilmember Gibson, when you hear the phrase defund the police, what does that mean to you? What do you think people are saying? And then what do you then translate in action as a responsible legislator?
I think it depends on which New Yorkers you talk to, neighborhood by neighborhood. I think the defund the NYPD advocacy has really come from obviously the horrific murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and many Black Americans feeling that enough is enough. We're tired of seeing Black Americans assaulted and brutalized by police violence across the country. I think when you look at the two pandemics of COVID-19, where we've lost thousands of Black and brown New Yorkers that have lost their battle to the pandemic, but also the pandemic of 401 years of systemic racism in America, I think people are frustrated. And the defund the police movement really was an acknowledgement of a $6 billion budget by the NYPD that many believe needed to have a significant cut. Now, how we got there is obviously the question at hand, and many agree, some don't. Some think we went too far, some think it wasn't enough. But I also want to remind everyone that for the City Council, this was the toughest budget we've ever faced. $7 billion loss in revenue, $9 billion budget deficit, $2 billion cut in the state adopted budget in April, and no federal money. So the budget that we've adopted, the $88 billion, was essentially reserves that we've been pushing the administration to put into our reserve budget, but also cuts, significant cuts that are going to hurt New Yorkers across the city. So it wasn't pretty, it wasn't easy. We came to a place of balance. Many of us thought it was the best we could do with the situation we were given, but with no federal support, no help from Albany, we had to make some really tough decisions.
So just back to the original question about defund. So you interpreted that to mean cuts, not to literally defund the police. Now, there are some on one side who say, we really mean defund, no fund the police. And then, of course, on the other side, there are many people who say, especially given what happened over the last weekend, are you out of your mind? What we need now is police. So,
right.
And so it sounds like the notion of cut is in the middle somewhere.
So the cut is somewhere in the middle, and we were never given a number when this process first started. The $1 billion, I believe, came from all of the advocacy of New Yorkers protesting on the streets. So I look at the word defund as a complete discontinuation of an agency, all $6 billion, where we would no longer need the NYPD. And when I questioned that to many people that approached me, they said, well, no, we don't want to abolish the NYPD. We want significant cuts. And then I saw a number of 1 billion, I saw 2 billion, I saw 3 billion. But I think, obviously people wanted to really send a message that an agency like the NYPD needed to change. And many believe that we could make some of those changes and deal with some of the issues we face with NYPD in a one-year budget.
Councilman Cohen, the same question for you. When you hear the word defund, are you on the same page as your colleague, or do you have a different interpretation?
Before I answer your question, I just want to give Vanessa a shout out because we all work hard on the budget, but Vanessa is also one of the Bronx representatives on the budget negotiating team, which is an enormous amount of work. So I'm not saying I didn't work hard on the budget, but Vanessa really did work exceptionally hard. And like she said, the process this year was painful, incredibly difficult, and there was an enormous amount of work. So the budget negotiating team, Vanessa, Councilmember Salamanca, and Councilwoman Ayala really were at the forefront for the Bronx delegation. So it just deserves credit.
If I can just interject what the governor said, the governor, when he was asked about the state budget, he said the budget went fine. We have no money, so what can I tell you? But anyway,
and they cut us $2 billion.
Yeah, go ahead, Councilman. I'm sorry.
I think that there were two things coming together. There was the movement in terms of like the issues that Vanessa said, defunding the police is a movement. But there were also the physical realities of, we didn't have enough money to fully fund the budget at the NYPD budget at the same level it's been anyway. So there were things coming together. I think that for me, some of the policy change, it was an opportunity to make real substantive policy changes. The idea of getting NYPD being out of our schools as the primary school safety agency, I think makes a lot of sense. And this was an opportunity to do that and get that done, trying to make sure that young people are not encountering NYPD when they, have a behavior issue at school, I think really is smart policy, and this was an opportunity to get that done. So I was not really caught up in the language. I try to focus on the policy and do what I think is right, and I think that this was an opportunity to trim the NYPD budget, which we didn't have the money again to fully fund it at the level we want that it's been historically anyway. And then I think we made some smart changes.
I'm going to just weigh in. When I heard defund the police, and my idea, I guess, was similar to what both of you are suggesting, is a reapportionment. And if you told me that we were going to take $1 billion and move that money from a criminal justice budget and put it into gang prevention or put it into community centers and summer youth employment and things like that, I would say, well, then we're not only removing money from the police, but giving them less to do because our young people will be more gainfully employed. So we'll start with you, Councilmember Cohen, and we'll get to you, Councilmember Gibson, in a moment. Where did this money go? You've already talked about the reform with the school safety officers. Was it tangible money that was then moved to other more valuable or a different way of looking at criminal justice? Or was it really a cut, and now, that was one of the billions that was cut out of the budget?
I think it's a combination of things that were done to reduce the money in the police's budget. Some of it was reapportioned, and again, some of it represents just cuts. We did not have, as you started the show, there was a tremendous drop in revenue for the city of New York. And it only made sense that the police department, like all the rest of the city agencies, things that we really care about, we're going to take a haircut. So some of them are, moving things around, but moving things around in a way that really, I think, is going to make policing smarter and more efficient and make us, I think, make us safer in some ways, and certainly not jeopardize public safety. Both Vanessa and I are pretty pro-police for council members. And we wanted to come up with a policy and a budget that kept the public safe, but also I think is reflective of changing attitudes.
Councilmember Gibson, were there things that you said, if we're not spending on traditional criminal justice enforcement, maybe this could be used for a more creative way, much like, you know, a district attorney creates a youth productive program or something like that, or goodness gracious, fund United Neighborhood Houses and, you know, all our community
We
centers.
like them.
Oh yeah, well, you're the one who has a chance. I'm just talking. But you know, that kind of thing, if you put $300 million into that, you literally could change some neighborhoods.
Right. I think there were a couple of things that we had to obviously look at. Number one, we had to maintain city workforce. There were many council members that were adamantly opposed to laying off city workers, like newly hired cops that are mostly Black and brown officers, as well as school safety agents, which are majority of African American women. This is the first time in my tenure that I ever remember seeing a significant cut at the NYPD. Their budget has grown year after year under this administration, but we've never seen the cuts to this level. Many people were not happy with the way we got to $1 billion once we identified that as a real number, $1 billion in expense. 350 million of that is going to be overtime reduction, which we believe is a way to get us to a point where we reduce overtime by uniformed officers. The transfer of school safety is not a real savings because that money will be kept in DOE's budget. So people were upset about that. We also are going to be looking at more restorative justice work, healing centers, holistic services, trauma-informed care. We're going to transform school safety agents so that they are a part of the solution and not the problem. So I don't want people to think that it's just a transfer of money from one agency to another, but it's also to redefine what policing looks like in our schools and in our communities. A part of that $1 billion was also a reduction in the overall uniformed headcount. So we eliminated the April class that never started, the July class that would have started this month that did not start. That what has been eliminated. So that is a reduction in their headcount by 1,163 officers that are reduced. Now, some think that's too much, some wanted more. I think at the end of the day, Gary, our challenge was coming to a place of balance and agreement where we could get the votes to pass a budget. Some members who are conservative that felt like that would be an issue with deployment and response times were concerned. We've had a wave of shootings in certain parts of our city. So people were generally concerned. So I think at the end of the day, balancing all of that, and some people think that $1 billion in cuts is a blank check for $1 billion to spend. And it doesn't work that way. The budget has to be balanced. So we really didn't have $1 billion to spend on social services in order to balance the budget.
You guys saw it, may not have come up in the Zoom, but you know, rats, we certainly would.
It's not an exact transfer.
Vanessa, also tell Gary about the Capitol, because that really is being redirected into community centers.
Well, let's talk about that. I do want to follow up about the police force in general and safety in general, but okay. Remember, that's fine.
But that's NYPD Capitol.
Right. So in addition to the $1 billion in expense cuts for the NYPD, there was also a significant portion of capital that we eliminated the 116th precinct that we were going to build at $92 million in Southeast Queens. And we also eliminated a $423 million construction of a new property clerk's office. So all of that money is now going to be used for the implementation of broadband in NYCHA developments across the portfolio, specifically going to the NYCHA developments who were hit the hardest by COVID. We have numbers and data on the number of public housing residents that died of COVID-19. So we're going to go back and reinvest broadband and work with housing, work with the TA leaders to make sure that there is a real reinvestment in our communities.
I want to talk about the safety issue because many people, and now we swing to the other side, who say, wait a minute, you're cutting out police. We know that there was bail reform. The morale of the police department right now, I think, would be, I'm not a police officer, but you would think, especially the elimination of the special forces that worked on removing guns. Anti-crime units and other units like that. And many people could say, well, wait a minute, you did that and look what happened. It didn't take long, it took a week. So are you concerned that either cuts or this new look at the police department, even if they're the right things, legislatively, the morale of the police department, I mean, we need our police force to fight for us. I mean, we all know that. So what do you think? We'll start with you, Councilmember Gibson, and Councilmember Cohen, you could respond.
I agree. I think I represent a district where I've had a number of shootings in my community. I have residents and seniors and homeowners that are very worried about the impact on quality of life and their daily operations of, walking in the community. They're very worried. Community council meetings have not been good. because the commanding officers have been very honest about, some of the realities. I think that this has been, a challenging time for all of us. We support policing. We support good policing. We want cops in our neighborhoods. We don't want abusive cops. No one would ever accept abuse in their communities, particularly when it's been hardest felt in communities of color. We have to bridge that gap. We have to rebuild the relationships, because I do think we've taken a step back. The data that we've seen does not prove that there is a direct correlation between bail reform and the detainees that have been released from Rikers due to COVID. Those are not the same individuals that are out committing these shootings. A small population of those individuals have reoffended and been rearrested, but many of them are not the shooters. They are the victims, they're the witnesses, and the data has shown that. So I don't think that the blame game is really productive right now. I think what we have to do as a community is work together and not rely on NYPD to do everything. It is not their job to solve poverty, underemployment, the issues that we face in our communities. We need residents, the crisis management system, clergy, community groups. We need everyone to come together, because this is our neighborhood and we have to make sure that we're all safe.
I'm going to move the question toward Councilmember Cohen and say that, all the things that Councilmember Gibson said, it sounds to me like, are true. But unless you have a motivated police force, and there doesn't seem to be a dialogue between, okay, this is how we're going to approach it now that the police, that NYPD accepts. We keep hearing, pushback from not only certainly the union head, but also from the police commissioner, who's like clearly not happy. So, Councilmember, I'm just aiming toward how are we going to resolve this disconnect between the police force and the communities they serve.
All right. Well, before I'm critical of the NYPD, I'm going to be, I think in context. When Councilwoman Gibson and I became council members, there was not a single NYPD officer wearing a body camera. There have been tremendous progress in New York City on modernizing and creating a police force that I think reflects the way that New Yorkers want to be policed. And I think that they deserve a lot of credit for that. I don't think that they get a lot of credit for that. I think that, currently a lot of people are glomming all police departments into one monolithic entity, and that's not the case. In New York State, even though people like to criticize us from, there's not a state officer wearing a body camera, none of them. So we're leading the way in a lot of ways, and I think that needs to be recognized. However, I think that there's still a long way to go. And ultimately, the NYPD is charged with effectuating the laws that Vanessa and I passed, that it's not up to them to decide we don't like this law or we do like this law. We're the policymakers in NYPD, and Commissioner Shea needs to figure out a way to motivate his force to do the job that they're charged with doing. And that's ultimately up to the administration to make that happen.
I was going to say that maybe that is something that falls at the feet of the mayor's office. That's for a dialogue at a different time. Before we do run out of time, I want to move off the budget slightly and just talk about schools, because another issue that is being bandied about is how we ought to do this. Do we open the schools for a couple of days a week? Do we fill classrooms? And then there are many people on both sides. Certainly teachers are saying, wait a minute, you're not putting me in a crowded place. And certainly parents would be concerned about their children with other kids. Getting children it's hard enough getting adults to wear masks. Getting children to wear masks consistently, the child feels uncomfortable, they're going to take them, it's going to happen. So I don't know, Councilman Cohen, let's start with you. What do you think? What ought to be done? Should we just be patient and say, you know what, it can't happen yet? Let's take our time. Parents will go crazy.
I will say that I've gotten a number of parents who've reached out to our office. I think that the mayor and the chancellor's announcement did not really satisfy a lot of people. One of the things that I find is just a challenge generally in my office is when I became a council member, no one gave me a crystal ball. And I don't really know what it's going to be like in September, what the conditions on the ground are going to be like. And I think the DOE is doing their best in terms of developing a plan A, a plan B, a plan C. Right now the numbers in New York City are really good, but that doesn't mean that's how they're going to be in the fall. So I think that parents and children were all victims of COVID, and that is presenting enormous hardships. I hope that we can come up with a plan that has kids in school as much as possible, that looks as normal as it can be, but it's going to have to be a decision that's going to be made closer to as to the opening time.
It sounds to me like you kind of want to lick your finger and stick it out the window and see which way the wind blowing. And I'm not criticizing that. I'm saying, given the realities, we don't even know. God forbid we had a spike in New York, which we haven't seen in a little while. You don't know. Councilmember Gibson, your thoughts on the opening?
Gary, I think we want to make an evidence-based decision, a science-based decision on how the best to open our schools. And I think that we need, as we get closer to the opening, we'll have as good a data as we can have, and that's when I think the decision really should be made.
Do you have a sense of what your constituents, the people who do call your office, are advocating, or is it really split across the board like I presented it?
Mostly, I think people want to get their kids in school, if that's possible.
One way or the other. Yeah, Councilmember Gibson, your thought?
So I think it is a challenging process. The DOE is doing their very best. They're also talking to other large cities on what they're doing to implement some sort of a remote learning or homeschooling for their September start as well. I think many of our parents, particularly my school district, District 9, want their children to go back, but they obviously want them to be safe as they do everyone else, the educators and teachers. I think there's a way we have to do it, and we have to be very strategic. We have to continue to engage advocates and parents and leaders, CECs, all of the leadership, the unions are very important in this conversation. But I want to be mindful that many of our parents are working. So the option of homeschooling is not available for many of them. What I would like to see, and I'm starting to have those conversations now, is for the different cohort that you choose. If your child goes to school on a Wednesday and a Friday and they alternate on a Monday, on that Tuesday and Thursday of that week where you don't have a place for your child to go to school, we should make sure that our community organizations and CBOs and community centers are places that can fill that gap. So there's a place for a child to go, still has recreation and learning for the day, and a parent can go to work. That is my greatest concern about my working parents that are returning to work. Where are their children going to go? And then also, are they going to still be able to learn and get the same curriculum? For those that have the opportunity to be homeschooled, I wonder what that curriculum looks like. Worried about D75 and students with disabilities. I have a large concentration of students in temporary housing and IEPs. So those are my priorities, as well as the co-locations and the campuses. I have Taft, right, which has 2,500 kids. I have Morris High School, which has 3,000. So these are big campuses. So I wonder how this is going to work. What I did hear that I was very pleased about is the Department of Ed is not moving forward with any new co-locations in September, because I had one, and I said, you can't do it because they need the space now.
Right. I want to just go back to the budget. I guess it's my job to ask the tough questions about, what people don't like or whatever. But I pulled out some things, from various articles and things in the budget, and we'll give you each a chance to comment on any of them. I mean, and whether you think it's too low or too much, or, you think we did well. Let's see, $8.4 million for senior centers, $6.5 million, because I want people to know that there is something in there. There's money somewhere. For naturally occurring retirement communities for the North, $4 million to support Holocaust survivors, which were hardest hit by COVID. $100 million was restored in fair student funding. 11.6, you can't see now, but council members.
Single Shepherd, woo!
Right, and I was just going to say 11.6 million for the Single Shepherd guidance counselors, which is so important. 4.8 million for social workers. 1.8 million for other social emotional supports for students. There were funding toward New York City Housing Authority properties and services throughout the city. Building 3 community centers, which that's my, if you had me in the city council, I'd be advocating for that. And all those kinds of things. So Councilmember Gibson, we'll start with you. What out of what I said do you really like, or are you still disappointed in, or you think we didn't go far enough?
Well, I think we did the very best we could. Again, given the circumstances, we had to make significant cuts to get to a place. If you look at what we attempted to do with no federal dollars and no additional revenue, we got up to $700 million in priorities that we cared about: fair student funding, CUNY ASAP, social workers, guidance counselors, summer youth, and that whole pot of Beacon, Compass, Sonic, Cornerstone programs. So when you put everything together, I want to remind Bronxites that we really started at a place of zero. The administration wanted to fund none of this, none, zero. They wanted no cuts to NYPD, no summer youth programs, no summer camp, nothing. So we got to a place where we felt like we pushed enough. And some people argue, well, why didn't you, hold out longer? Because it was July 1st and CBOs needed to start their programs and they needed the budget. So we couldn't hold out. I am proud of a lot of what we did. What you just described, a lot of those are a part of our city council initiatives that we've consistently funded year after year, plus our council discretionary, plus one shots that the administration picked up last year that they didn't pick up this year, no intention to pay for it, like Fair Student Funding, like Fair Futures, which is the program for foster youth that we got restored at 10 million. So a lot of these things we had to balance. There was so many buckets that we had to get to. The last bucket were ped cuts that we had to restore as well.
I do want to get to Councilmember Cohen before we run out of time. So you get to talk good news or things that you're happy about or things that you still think need a little attention.
Yeah, one of the things that I don't know if people know, but how dependent all the not-for-profits that we use, that we take for granted in our daily life are really dependent on city council dollars. MMCC, JASA, providing all of that programming. So it was really incredibly.
Bronx Works and Wedco. I mean, there.
Yes,
we have,
Children's
we have
Aid. Yes,
we have 1,200 not-for-profits in the Bronx. Let's face it.
All incredibly dependent on city council funding. So it was incredibly important that we get a budget done on time. Ultimately, if we were going to have any summer youth, like waiting again till July 1st made it incredibly difficult. People should know that they can still apply for summer youth. So it was important to get the job done so that that people wouldn't lose their jobs. There were 1,400 seasonal parks workers that were still on hold waiting for adoption of the budget. And our parks are never busier than they are right now. So we felt enormous pressure to get it done, to get the city moving. It was a very, very difficult budget. It was painful. But I feel like, Councilman Gibson and I, it was real leadership to get this budget done and to keep the city moving. So,
well, thank you both. Also, I would thank you for joining us. The dialogue, and I think being able to deliver, firsthand information to Bronxites. That's what I do, and we're really thrilled that both Councilmember Andrew Cohen and Councilmember Vanessa Gibson joined us this evening. Thank you both for joining us. We know that we're going to ask you to come back again. Let's hope it's for good news.
That's fine. Yes,
we'll
get through this, Gary.
Which we could all use a lot of. Anyway, that's it for tonight. Thanks to our great producer, Helen Greenberg. We will be doing more Bronx Talk. Next week, we're going to talk about mental health. We're going to try and talk about it. The fact, what are we all feeling? We all know how we're feeling. We'll try to put that together and maybe make people feel better if we can. We'll see you then. Good night. Stay safe.